Spring of 1200 BC, in the stone courtyard of the Temple of Amun at Karnak, the sun beats down like a burning blade on the flagstones. Ibises take flight, and the metallic echo of a bronze scraper cuts through the air. A little girl trembles. Her name is Nefertari, and she is 9 years old. 3 days earlier, her father brought her through the monumental gate, spoke solemn words about honor and service, and left without looking back. Now a priestess holds her head, while another runs the blade over her scalp with slow and steady movements, until the last black braid falls to the ground like a defeated snake. The girl wants to hold on to something of her own, a lock of hair, a name, a memory, but every stroke of the metal snatches it away. When the tears begin to well up, a sharp, brief, and calculated slap strikes her cheek. "The servants of the god do not cry," the voice decrees. "You have no tears, you have no name. You belong to Ammon." The wind from the Nile brings the smell of water and reeds. But here, among columns like petrified forests, the air smells of natron, incense, and obedience. This is not a myth or a moralizing fable told at nightfall. It is history. It is written on walls and papyri, in lists of rations and debts, in the crooked signatures of scribes who believed they had fixed the order of the world. The temple, to the modern visitor, seems like the triumph of beauty, painted reliefs, rows of hieroglyphs promising eternity. But for Nefertari, for thousands like her, it is a machine that grinds up lives and gives them a new name to erase the old one. Because in Egypt, the temple is not just an altar, it is a granary, a bank, a court, an archive, and a border. It is a state within a state, and its first law is purity, a sweet word that, in the mouth of power, means availability. The girl tries to remember what her father said, that serving the gods was a higher calling than any other destiny. She remembers her small house, the smell of barley bread, a song her mother hummed at dawn. But singing does not enter here. Here, everything is recited. The priests mark time with millennial formulas, and between one and the next, they place invisible bricks around the girl. Isolation, silence, repetition. The Greeks, centuries later, will speak of catharsis. The Romans of sacred discipline. Here they call it purification. It begins with the body to reach the soul. It is washed, scraped, and renamed. Identity becomes wet clay, and expert hands mold it until the mirror reflects the image the institution wants to see. The day wears on. The light falling from above, between architraves, traces perfect rectangles on the floor. A young priest holds a bowl of water mixed with natron. Another checks a tablet, age, origin, debt canceled with service. Nothing of what Nefertari was matters anymore, except as a box in an accounting ledger. When the bronze mirror is brought close to her, the girl does not recognize the girl. The polished surface reflects a bare head, a broad forehead with a purplish bruise, eyes that are too large. The reflection does not lie, but neither does it tell the whole truth. The cruelest part of the rite is not in what is seen, but in what the narrating voice inside the girl begins to repeat. "I no longer belong to myself. I belong to the God." Language deep down is the finest dagger. It is worth remembering before continuing that the architecture of the sacred has always known how to speak the language of awe. Hypostyle columns, proportions, calculated to dwarf the visitor, shadows and lights that follow one another like breaths of stone. All this teaches the correct gesture. Bowed head, soft steps, silence, long before anyone utters an order. The images on the walls, solar boats, offerings, lotus flowers, sing a promise of cosmic balance, mat, while hiding the gears that maintain that balance. Forced labor, surveillance, punishment. Nefertari enters this living fresco not as an honored priestess, but as a spare part. Those listening today might object. Perhaps these were chosen vows. Perhaps there was honor and prestige. The word virgin is deceiving. It suggests ritual dignity, a kind of luminous distance. In practice, it meant control. Purity not as a virtue, but as a regime. Purity that defines what you touch, what you eat, what you say, what you think. Purity that if it were a color would be a white incapable of admitting nuances. If it were a sound, it would be a constant hum that cancels out all others. That hum begins today for Nefertari. She will learn to rise before dawn, to wash and wash again, to dress in simple linen, to walk without leaving a trace, to not speak unless spoken to. Obedience as choreography. In this inaugural scene, two narratives intersect that are rarely admitted together, that of devotion and that of debt. Nefertari's father, a minor official, could not pay in grain or silver. He paid in future. There is nothing older than that barter, saving the house by handing over the daughter, and nothing more modern than the rhetoric that surrounds it. It is an honor. She has been chosen. The goddess will protect her. Where there is power, there is grammar. Where there is grammar, there is euphemism. The history of religions shows it time and again. It is enough to pronounce a divine name for a human act to change its moral category. So what do we really see in the courtyard of Karnak? We see a small body entering the orbit of a sun that is too large. We see a millennial institution executing with precision what it calls a welcome. We see how beauty, the kind that will travel for centuries on postcards and photographs, serves as a veil for the simplest and most terrible gesture, taking away. Taking away hair, taking away a name, taking away choice. And behind the right, the logic that sustains it, cold as a scale. Bodies go in, labor comes out, wills go in, silence comes out, little girls go in, shadows come out. When the ceremony ends, an old woman places a fine linen cloth over Nefertari's bare head that provides no warmth. She guides her toward a dark threshold. "Cross," she orders. The girl obeys. With every step, the courtyard is left behind, and with it, the light. Inside, it smells of oil and damp stone. The first night is always long, say those who have already learned to measure time with their eyes open. Somewhere, far away, the river keeps flowing. Here, everything has stopped to mold her into the shape of the god. And yet, like a thin thread, a question persists that no one asks. If the gods are strong, why do they first need to break a little girl? There is no answer on the walls, only perfect scenes where everyone plays their part. The answer, perhaps, lies in the crack that was not painted, in the whisper that was not written, in the tear that was ordered not to be shed. Because every civilization tells its story in marble and gold. The victims leave theirs in the dust. Today in Karnak, the dust has learned a new name, Nefertari, who will no longer be Nefertari. And this is just the first step on a path darker than the shadows between the columns. What comes next will not be piety disguised as ritual, but power dressed as eternity. And we will begin to understand that behind every perfect hymn, there is a broken voice. During the years of the New Kingdom, Egypt was a network of temples as vast as the Nile itself. They were not just places of worship. They were the banks, the warehouses, the courts, and the granaries of a theocratic state. Within their walls, it was decided who ate, who owed, who prayed, who stayed silent. Every statue of a god hid an accounting ledger. Every offering carried the price of a body. And among the most costly were the little girls. Sometimes they arrived holding their parents' hands like Nefertari, believing the soft words of the priests, "The god will protect her." Other times they arrived in caravans of captives. The pharaoh's army brought tributes from Nubia, Syria, and Libya. Among the ingots and leopard skins also came creatures with frightened eyes. Mutmuya was one of them. She was 8 years old when she was separated from her mother in a village near the first cataract. They tied her up with 12 other girls and made them walk north, under a sun that turned the ground into a mirror. She quickly learned not to cry. Whoever cried received the whip. By the time she reached Thebes, nothing remained of the song her mother had sung to bid her farewell. The scribes recorded their names, or what they understood of them, on clay tablets. Those names were distorted, Egyptianized, and in that twisting, their origin was lost. The girls were purified and assigned to different temples according to the needs of the deities. Some for Amun, others for Mut, others for Hathor, she who gives and takes away fertility. None would ever see the free horizon again. The river, which had been their path, would become a border. What for the families was a gesture of survival, saving themselves from debt or starvation, for the temple was a business. Each girl represented years of unpaid service. Her value was calculated in grain, her labor power, her ability to produce textiles, bread, hymns, pleasure. It was a perfect system, Religious power clothed its economy in sacred words. They said offering, but it meant payment. They said consecrated, but it was property. And purity, instead of a virtue, became a guarantee of control. It took Mutmoya months to understand the words of her guardians. She learned Egyptian the way one learns an order. Every syllable was a chain. When she finally understood what the chant said, she discovered they spoke of rebirth, of a God who creates the world by separating light and darkness. She smiled without knowing why. Her own world had been created anew, but in reverse. Her light had been taken away. Nefertari, on the other hand, was already learning to navigate the geometry of the temple. Hallways that lead nowhere, courtyards where sound multiplies, windowless rooms. There she met other girls who shared the same fate. Some still believed in the priest's promises. Others, older, had learned to look without seeing. At night, when the walls turned the color of honey under the lamps, their voices blended with the buzzing of insects. There was fear, but also something else, a mute solidarity, the instinct of knowing they were equals in misfortune. The priest spoke of the sacred gift of childhood, as if innocence itself were a currency. For them, the younger the girl, the purer her soul, the more fit to serve the god. In practice, it meant that childhood became the perfect tribute, soft, moldable, incapable of refusing. The entire society accepted it. The father who handed over his daughter was not condemned, but praised. Neighbors said the family was blessed. Faith served as a collective anesthesia. On the banks of the Nile, every dawn repeated the same scene. A peasant bowing, a scribe recording, a little girl being taken away, and the river kept flowing, indifferent. Thus, over the centuries, thousands of lives dissolved into the ritual silence of the temples. History would call them the gods' wives, the goddesses' hands, the pure ones. But beneath those titles, the reality was different. A network of submission inherited and blessed by those who knew how to use the word divine to cover up the unspeakable. Mutmuya and Nefertari never met, but their destinies were mirrors. One sold for debt, the other kidnapped as tribute. Two different paths that led to the same altar. And if we could hear them, perhaps they would say the same thing as thousands of voices silenced for centuries. That faith can be a prison more solid than bronze. That fear can be a language learned before the word mother. From the distance of centuries, it is easy to judge, to think those were different times. But one only has to look closer. In every era, there are temples that feed on innocence, and every society has its own silent sacrifices. In Egypt, the gods demanded purity. In the modern world, obedience is demanded. The names change, not the structure. And so, in the second year of her servitude, Nefertari stopped counting the days. She learned to work the linen, to obey gestures, to stay silent before thinking. Mutmuya, at the other end of the country, was learning the same thing, albeit in another language. Both were becoming, without knowing it, cogs in a machine that would outlive their bones. And under the immense shadow of the columns, history ran its course, as if childhood had never been anything more than a legitimate tribute to gods of stone. When a girl was declared a servant of the god, the first step was not teaching, but dispossession. The body had to be cleansed, the mind emptied, the memory dismantled. Everything began with water. The texts call it the bath of purity. But what really happened was a rehearsal for subjugation. In an enclosed courtyard, the priests waited with stone bowls filled with water and natron. The girls, naked, were pushed one by one into the pool. There were no prayers, only orders. Do not tremble. Do not look away. Do not breathe until we tell you to. Thus they learned from the very first moment that obedience was more important than fear. Nefertari felt the freezing water run down her skin. She tried to cover herself, but a rough hand gripped her arms. They told her the gods were watching, that her body had to be examined to prove it had no blemish. 3 priests and 2 older women surrounded her. The oldest muttered prayers while his fingers touched her like someone inspecting a newly carved statue. The touch held neither pity nor tenderness. It was an act of ownership. She did not understand. She only knew that resisting was a sin. She wept in silence. her gaze fixed on the trembling reflection of the lamps on the water. In that mixture of tears and natron began her transformation, from person to object. In another temple, Mutmuya was going through the same ritual. She did not understand the words, but she understood the tone. In her language, water was a symbol of life. Here it was an instrument of control. Every splash stole a part of her name. When they finally let her out of the pool, they wrapped her in linen and shaved her head. Her hair, which in Nubia was a source of pride and a sign of family belonging, fell to the ground like dry grass. An old woman gathered it with a ceremonious gesture and threw it into the fire. The flames rose quickly, leaving a sour smell in the air, a mixture of grease and smoke. "The past has been purified," the woman said. Mutmuya did not know whether to laugh or scream. After the bath and the fire came the silence. For days, the girls were not allowed to speak. They were told that their tongues had to learn the language of the temple before uttering any other word. It was a dense, sharp silence in which every thought became a suspicion. When they were finally allowed to speak, it was only to repeat memorized phrases. "I belong to the god. My body is sacred. My will does not belong to me." Thus the mind was tamed, just like the body. The final act of this metamorphosis was the name change. Nefertari, she who was the most beautiful, became Nefert Nebet, beautiful for the lady. Mutmuya received the title Hand of Mut. Names that sounded like blessings but were cages. A name given by others does not name, it confines. Every time someone called them by their new title, it reminded them that their previous identity was dead. If any dared to utter her birth name, she was punished with fasting or beatings. Some learned to repeat it only in their minds, in their dreams, like a secret amulet. Egyptian religion was an expert at turning psychology into liturgy. It knew that to control a body, it first had to break the image it had of itself. Shave, rename, isolate, 3 steps to undo the notion of self. Modern texts would call it brainwashing, the priest's purification of the soul, but the result was the same, absolute docility. In the eyes of the temple, there was no cruelty, only method. When Nefertari looked at herself in the bronze mirror after the ritual, she did not recognize the creature staring back at her. The smooth head, the red eyes, the skin marked by the cold of the natron. That was not the girl who had run along the river. It was someone else, manufactured. They told her the god loved her, that pain was a sign of divine favor. She quickly learned that every word of comfort hid a threat. The more you suffer, the purer you become. From then on, suffering was her new language. In the temple archives, every change was recorded with bureaucratic precision: date, origin, function. There was no emotion in the hieroglyphic signs, only the efficiency of a divine administration. The temples were machines for writing names and erasing lives. Outside, the people saw in this a marvel of cosmic order. Inside, the victims learned that order was not balance, but hierarchy. From time to time, a girl would try to resist. A movement, a gesture, a look that betrayed rebellion. That was enough for a veteran priestess to drag her away and make her repeat the vows again until her voice broke. After each correction, the silence returned, heavier than before. Thus, little by little, innocence was domesticated. In this purification, the secret of religious power was condensed, transforming humiliation into virtue. What began as fear ended up being faith. When Nefertari closed her eyes that night, she told herself that the gods knew what they were doing. She believed it because it was easier than accepting the truth. Outside, the moon reflected on the waters of the Nile, that same water that hours before had washed her body. In the remote glimmer of the river, something of hers still lived, a spark that refused to be extinguished. She did not know it, but that spark would be the only thing to survive the rite. The rest, name, body, will, already belonged to the temple. 2 years after her arrival, Mutmuya had learned the language, the chants, and the gestures. She was 10 years old and already walked with her head bowed, without looking the priests in the eye. But that morning she was awakened before dawn. They told her she had been chosen for a special ceremony, an honor few received. They dressed her in white linen, placed a braided wig on her, and painted her eyelids with dark kohl. An older woman whispered in her ear, "Today you will marry the goddess Mut." Mutmuya did not fully understand, but the tone left no room for questions. The temple of the goddess was illuminated with oil lamps. The air smelled of resin and copper. In the center, a statue of Mut, with eyes inlaid with lapis lazuli, watched the scene from its pedestal. Around it, the priests formed a circle and recited ancient prayers. The girl stepped forward among them, guided by an invisible hand of obedience. In her hands, she carried a lotus flower, a symbol of rebirth. When she reached the altar, the high priest, covered in a golden mask, raised his voice. The goddess receives her wife. Purity enters eternity. Then he ordered her to repeat the words that would seal her fate. I give myself to Mut. My body is her temple. My life is her property. I will serve in purity and obedience forever. She repeated them with the trembling voice of someone who does not understand what she is promising. Those phrases, recorded on a papyrus by a scribe, amounted to a contract. From that moment on, Mutmuya ceased to be a person and became the property of the temple. The marriage to the god was no metaphor. It carried legal weight. A divine wife could not marry a man or have recognized children. She could not own property or leave the sacred walls. The temple owned her from head to toe. On the surface, everything seemed like a celebration. The priests sang hymns that spoke of sacred union, of balance between heaven and earth. But behind that poetry lay a brutal logic. The woman's body turned into an instrument for legitimizing power. The bride of the god served as living proof that the gods acted in the world, and the priests were their intermediaries. In other words, divine marriage was the religious version of state ownership. History is full of echoes of that ritual. In Mesopotamia, the hierodules served the temple of Ishtar with the same fate, an offering disguised as an honor. In Rome, the Vestal virgins kept the sacred fire under an oath of chastity, but their bodies belonged to the state. In Vedic India, the Devadasis were consecrated to the gods and given to the men who represented them. The mechanism repeats itself, dressing domination in the colors of the sacred, calling service what is servitude. When the priest took the lotus flower from Mutmuya's hands, the girl felt a strange emptiness, as if something had been torn out from inside her. She did not understand the nature of the ceremony, but she sensed its gravity. The sound of the chants weighed on her ears like a never-ending command. From that day on, the others looked at her with a mixture of respect and fear. She was the god's wife. No one could touch her, but everyone could use her in the name of the god. Nefertari witnessed a similar rite years later, in the temple of Amun. The hall was filled with smoke and reddish light. The high priest, dressed in gold, extended his arms and proclaimed, Amun takes his servant. In the eyes of the people, it was an act of sublime devotion. In the eyes of the women of the temple, it was a sentence. They knew what followed, even if none said it aloud. The hieroglyphs on the wall describe that moment with beautiful words. The god enters his dwelling. The divine seed fertilizes the earth. But behind those precisely carved lines is the silence of the victims, the flesh reduced to a symbol, the voice erased by the liturgy. The god did not descend from the sky. He wore a mask and breathed. From the perspective of modern philosophy, we could call it what it was, a politics of the body. Religious power turns biology into theology, and in that equation, pain translates as merit. The chosen girls were proclaimed blessed, but they lived in a marriage without a husband, in a faith without a choice. The idea was simple and terrible. If the god owns your body, no man needs to conquer it. If the priest represents the god, all resistance becomes a sin. The girl Mutmuya, now the wife of Mut, was recorded in the temple books with a new title and a new task. She would sleep in a cell near the sanctuary, sing hymns at midnight, and remain pure. Purity in her case meant isolation. No one spoke to her for weeks. She learned that loneliness was the price of holiness. When she was finally able to go out, she walked through the courtyards with measured steps, as if the ground might break beneath her feet. And although the sun still shone on the columns, a definitive night had fallen inside her. Thus, under the pretext of divine union, the most perfect slavery was sealed, the kind that is accepted believing it to be an honor. What began as a rite became a chain. What was called consecration was a form of captivity, and yet the papyri recorded it as glory and the walls sculpted it as poetry. Perhaps that is why, thousands of years later, we keep repeating the same words without hearing the echo of their pain. The temples of Egypt were small sealed cities, worlds where the sun and time obeyed other laws. Inside, human voices were muffled under the weight of incense. The day began before dawn, when the sky was still violet and the river slept. A bronze bell called the servants of the god. Nefertari rose with the others, wrapped in the rough linen that scratched her skin. They slept on mats, side by side, under the watchful eye of older women who had lost even the ability to dream. Silence was the first prayer. No one could speak before the morning purification. They washed their bodies with water mixed with natron, adjusted their white tunics, and covered their shaved heads. Then in rows they marched to the work areas. Some ground grain for the sacred bread, others wove linen for the offerings, others tended the gardens or prepared ointments. Every movement was measured. A clumsy gesture, a distraction, could be interpreted as impurity. The temple was a factory disguised as a sanctuary. The product was not just bread or fabric, but obedience. Every strike of the mortar, every thread pulled tight on the loom, was a form of wordless prayer. Religion had turned monotony into virtue. Nefertari shared the loom with another girl named Takayat. She had arrived at the temple at the age of 11, and in 5 years her body had become as silent as the walls. Between the threads, when the supervisor was far away, they dared to whisper. "I dreamed of the fields," Takayat whispered. "There was fruit." "What does fruit taste like?" Nefertari asked. They were tiny, almost invisible sentences that lasted as long as it takes a thread to break. But in a world without voices, those words were rebellion. One morning, the noise of the loom stopped. The supervisor had approached without making a sound. She struck Takayat on the head with a wooden cane. Blood stained the linen. They dragged her out of the workshop. "This is how silence is learned by one who forgets she no longer has a voice," the woman said. Nefertari did not see her friend again for 3 days. When she returned, her eyes were empty and her hands trembled. She never spoke again. 2 months later, she disappeared forever. The official explanation was simple: impure, returned to the gods. No one asked, no one dared. That phrase, "returned to the gods," echoed in the corridors like a constant refrain. It was the way the temple named death. Just another euphemism, a mask. But the girls knew the truth. When someone was returned, the silence grew, and the food for a few days tasted like ash. The surveillance was absolute. The older women served as guards. They noted who cried, who talked in their sleep, who seemed distracted. The priests conducted regular inspections under the pretext of maintaining purity. They examined the bodies with hands that claimed to act in the name of the god. No one could refuse. The servant's body did not belong to her. It was divine property. Punishment was not always physical. Sometimes it was absence, isolating them for days in a lightless, foodless cell until the mind began to blur with the shadows. The most fragile came out of there turned into automatons, unable to remember their own faces. It was the pedagogy of fear, the one that teaches without words that any attempt to remember the self is blasphemy. However, even in that controlled environment, human thought found cracks. Some women invented invisible forms of resistance. In the temple's textiles, among the linen weaves, they embroidered tiny symbols: a broken circle, a deviated line. The priests thought they were mistakes. They knew they were signatures. A way of saying, "I am here." The routine repeated itself day after day until time lost its meaning. Childhood dissolved into obedience, youth into exhaustion. Laughter became a forbidden memory. Nefertari, who had once asked about the taste of fruit, stopped doing so. In her mind, only fragments remained: a voice, a smell, a shadow by the river. Memory was her only crime and her only refuge. From the outside, the temple looked like a paradise of order. Pilgrims saw cleanliness, rhythm, devotion. They did not see the empty eyes or the hunchbacks or the fear breathing in every corner. This is how every institution that confuses discipline with holiness operates. It erases the traces of suffering and turns it into harmony. At nightfall, when the lights went out and only the murmur of the Nile remained, Nefertari wondered if the god she served could hear her. if he knew what happened inside his walls, if that silence was also part of the cult. The answer always came back the same, a hollow echo, a wind that smelled of stone. Life in the temple did not kill all at once. It killed in layers, slowly, until one learned to confuse resignation with faith. And yet within those walls there were still gazes that had not entirely surrendered. Gazes that, one day, would make the perfect calm of the gods tremble. The temples did not merely seek docile bodies. They wanted convinced souls. Obedience had to feel like faith. From their earliest days, the girls were repeatedly told that they had been chosen, that the gods had blessed them by separating them from the corrupt world. Outside reigns chaos, here lives purity, the priest would say. Fear was the foundation of devotion. Fear of the profane, of the unknown, of themselves. Every day was marked by rituals that repeated the same idea. Their suffering had meaning. Their silence was sacred. The hymns spoke of submission and surrender. The body is a temple, pain an offering, obedience is salvation. The women sang those words while weaving or grinding grain until the syllables embedded themselves in their minds like a tattoo. To repeat was to believe. To believe was to survive. Sometimes the priests offered sermons. Standing on stone platforms, they said that purity was not only physical, but mental. That impure thoughts, nostalgia, sadness, desire, were traps of chaos. Anyone who remembered their past life was guilty of spiritual rebellion. This was how the system molded consciousness, by punishing memory and rewarding oblivion. Mutmuya, the girl from Nubia, soon understood that the temple's true enemy was not the body, but memory. Her native tongue was forbidden. The sounds of her childhood were considered impure. But at night, when sleep would not come, her mother's words returned to her mind like an underground river. One night she could not contain herself. In the darkness of the communal dormitory, she softly sang a fragment of an old Nubian song. It was a melody about the return of summer, gentle as the desert wind. She thought no one heard her. She was wrong. At dawn, they brought her before the high priest, a man with a stony face and eyes painted black. "What language did you speak?" he asked. "My mother's," she replied, trembling. The priest slapped her. "You have no mother. You have a goddess. You have no language. You have service." Mutmuya fell to the ground. She did not cry. They locked her in a cell for 7 days with barely any water and bread. When she came out, her voice was a whisper. She had learned the lesson. The past was heresy. But deep in her mind, she kept that song, repeating it in silence like an inverted prayer. Because as long as she remembered, she would still be herself. Indoctrination served not only to dominate, but to justify. The priests are the voice of the God, they said. To obey them is to obey heaven. If the servant's body was a temple, the priests were its guardians. That metaphor legitimized everything. If the guardian touched the temple, it was not violation, but a blessing. If he inspected it, it was not abuse, but purification. Thus, language transformed violence into virtue. Over the years, religion became a pedagogy of forced consent. The girls grew up learning that their bodies did not belong to them, and that their pain was necessary to maintain the balance of the universe. The idea of Ma'at, the cosmic order, was sustained by their silent sacrifice. No civilization can sustain its greatness without a narrative that absolves it. Egypt had found its own. Nefertari, now a teenager, listened to those doctrines and wanted to believe them. It was easier than facing the void. But some nights, while grinding grain under the moon, she felt a pang in her chest. What if the gods were nothing more than men in masks? What if it was all a lie to keep them quiet? Those questions were dangerous. A single doubt could mean punishment. So she hid them behind an obedient smile. The temple rewarded docility with small concessions. A piece of fruit, a clean garment, a kind look from a priest. Minimal gestures that seemed like miracles. It was the religious version of a psychological prison, making the victim grateful for the chain. Mutmuya understood this clearly one day when one of the elder priestesses told her in a low voice, "Child, freedom does not exist. Learn to find peace in your cage." But not all of them could do it. Some broke inside. They walked the corridors repeating meaningless prayers like empty echoes. Others took refuge in guilt. If I suffer, It is because I am not pure enough. That was the perfect trap, a system that fed on the faith of its prisoners. The temple's theology functioned like a seamless machine. It turned abuse into ceremony, obedience into salvation, guilt into a driving force. And while the people offered incense outside, believing the temple was the dwelling place of the gods, inside the true altar was made of the bodies and voices of the women who upheld the myth. At the end of the day, when silence returned and the incense smoke faded, Mutmuya would look up at the high ceiling of the sanctuary. There, among carved figures of falcons and suns, she wondered if the god watching from the darkness understood her language, the one she had promised never to speak again. If he truly was a god, he should know everything. But he never answered. Perhaps she thought the true silence was not in them, but in heaven. Nefertari was 14 years old when the high priest announced that she had been chosen for a supreme honor. They took her to the purification bath, perfumed her with myrrh oil, and dressed her in a translucent linen gown and a necklace of golden beads. The other women watched her with a mixture of pity and fear. No one desired that privilege. They called it the divine union, and they knew what it meant, a night none of them wanted to remember. The temple prepared for the ceremony. Oil lamps transformed the darkness into a reddish glow. Incense smoke filled the air with a sweet, heavy scent. In the center of the sanctuary, the statue of Amun seemed alive, bathed in shadows that made it breathe. In front of it, the high priest wore a golden mask bearing the god's features. Behind him, a choir of acolytes sang ancient words. The god enters his dwelling, life returns to the world. Nefertari was led to the altar. Her knees trembled. She did not understand why the priest's eyes gleamed as if they expected something more than a miracle. The priest raised his hands. "You have been chosen," he said. "Amun blesses you with his presence. Today you shall be his wife." The words echoed like hammer blows. The choir continued. Those present formed a circle around the altar. The sound of the drum grew slower, deeper. The priest approached. His voice transformed, deep and feigned. "I am Amun, Lord of Thebes. I claim you in my name." Nefertari took a step back. She wanted to flee, but the hands of two priests grabbed her by the arms. They told her she must obey, that the god would be angry if she showed fear. They promised her that afterwards she would be blessed, that the pain was a sign of divine favor. Everything that followed was recorded in the papyri as an act of worship. But what happened that night was not sacred at all. The god did not descend from heaven. He wore human skin, breathed, and lied. No words of Nefertari were preserved. No one recorded her scream, nor her silence. Only a dry line in the temple archives. Ritual successfully completed. The servant has been received by the god. In that bureaucratic euphemism hid the tragedy of thousands of women. The divine union was not a symbol, it was a practice. The priest who represented the god claimed the right to possess what they called the body of the temple. Egyptian religion, like many ancient ones, had turned desire into liturgy. In the hymns, the act was described with metaphors. The god's seed fertilizes the earth. The goddess opens her flower for the sky. But in the sanctuary, poetry transformed into coercion. And the most terrible thing was the faith that sustained that violence. The young women believed that their resistance would bring a curse upon the kingdom, that their pain saved the people, that their silence was a virtue. When it was all over, Nefertari was returned to her cell. She walked slowly, as if every step weighed centuries. No one spoke to her. The other women lowered their eyes. They knew the walls had ears. She did not sleep that night. She listened to the prayers of the priestesses, the footsteps of the guards, the buzzing of the lamps. In her mind, a phrase repeated like an echo. "I belong to the god. I do not belong to myself." Days passed and the routine continued. But something had changed. The faith that had sustained her began to crumble. Every time she heard a hymn about the goodness of the gods, she felt a knot in her stomach. She began to understand what Takiat had tried to tell her long ago. That the temple was not a dwelling of divinity, but a prison of power. That the priests were not messengers of heaven, but masters of the earth. And yet the cycle continued. At every festival of renewal, another young woman was chosen. They were dressed, adorned, and offered. The people applauded from outside without knowing what happened behind the walls. Religious propaganda turned rape into a fertility myth. The god fertilizes the earth, the text said, but it was the earth that bled and the god never answered. Over time, some of the servants became pregnant. The priest called it a blessing, proof that the god had accepted the ceremony. The children born of those unions were raised by the temple. If it was a girl, she became a servant of the god. If it was a boy, an apprentice priest. Thus the system perpetuated itself. The victim produced her replacement. The wound generated its heir. When Nefertari learned she was expecting a child, fear paralyzed her. She did not know who the father was, nor if she would be able to keep the baby. An old woman told her, "If a girl is born, the temple will take her. If it is a boy, they will educate him to forget who you are." That was the prophecy that sealed her fate. For months she hid her pregnancy under loose tunics, fearing discovery. But nothing escapes the eyes of the temple. The day her body revealed the truth, she was moved to another chamber, along with other women in the same condition. There, for the first time, she could speak without fear. They shared stories in low voices, as if the words were hot coals that needed to be passed from hand to hand. One of them said, "The God who made us mothers will not let us be mothers." Another, with a vacant stare, murmured, "We give birth for the temple, not for life." The cruelest sacrifice was not that of bodies, but of bonds. The temple had discovered how to break even the deepest instinct, a mother's love for her child. It turned motherhood into service, blood into a right. It was the ultimate triumph of manipulation, stealing the capacity to love without permission. When her daughter was born, Nefertari named her Nephura, she who breathes life. She held her for 3 years until the hands of the temple snatched her away. They told her she had to prepare for purity. Nefertari understood then that her story was repeating itself, like an endless offering. Sometimes, while weaving in the workshop, she would see the girl pass by with other little ones, their heads shaved, dressed in white. None of them called her mother. In her eyes, she recognized the same confusion, the same innocence she had had at 9 years old. And she understood that the circle would never be broken as long as the gods remained silent. The temple always knew that power was not maintained through punishments, but through inheritances. The daughters of the servants grew up within the same walls, breathing the same incense, learning the same silence. Nephura, Nefertari's daughter, knew no other reality. From the time she learned to walk, she was guided to the fountains where the women purified themselves. The old women called her Little Flower of Amun. She smiled, not understanding that the name was a chain wrapped in perfume. Nefertari watched her from afar. She could not approach her, nor speak her name aloud. The rules forbade it. Mothers were not to have contact with their daughters to avoid earthly attachment. Motherhood was seen as a distraction from divine service. But instinct does not understand rules. Nefertari found ways to watch without being seen. Down a hallway, through the folds of a curtain, in the shadow cast upon the floor. She watched the girls sing hymns, laugh, fall, and get back up. And every time she saw her, she felt something inside her tear between pride and despair. The temple claimed that the daughters born of the divine union were seeds of the god, beings destined to continue the cycle of purity. In reality, they were the living reminder of perpetuated and legitimized abuse. The priests raised them with calculated tenderness, like someone cultivating a flower that would serve for a future offering. In the eyes of the people, they were saints. Inside the walls, they were reserves. Nefertari's forbidden motherhood became her first form of rebellion. She could not protect her daughter, but she could remember her. Every night before sleeping, she silently recited an invented prayer. May her steps be her own. May her voice not be silenced. May the gods sleep, and may she awaken. It was a clandestine prayer, a spell against oblivion. Mutmuya, older and more tired, watched her in silence. She had spent so many years in the temple that her skin seemed made of the same dust as the columns. One night she told her, "Do not cry for what you cannot change. Cry for what your tears can still awaken." Nefertari looked at her without understanding. "Awaken what?" "Us. If one remembers, we all remember. If one names, everyone has a name again. That phrase ignited something that had been sleeping in Nefertari since she was a child. She began to save scraps of linen, small pieces of thread she found in the workshop. With them, she secretly wove a narrow band. On the back, she embroidered minuscule signs imperceptible to the naked eye. A broken line for every missing woman, a dot for every girl born. When the piece was finished, she hid it under a flagstone in the inner courtyard. It was her way of writing a history that no one would read, but that would exist. Meanwhile, Nefertari grew. At 5, she already knew the prayers. At 7, she was already serving in the procession. People pointed to her as blessed, and Nefertari from the shadows understood that her daughter's fate was sealed, just like hers. One afternoon during a ceremony, she saw a priestess take the girl's hand and lead her to the altar. Nefertari felt the same chill she had felt years ago. She knew the cycle was preparing to repeat itself. In that instant, the faith she still had broke completely. She could not pray to a God who fed on the children of his servants. She could not continue to believe in a purity that demanded such small and perfect sacrifices. She began to speak in secret with other women. Some listened to her with fear, others with a new gleam in their eyes. They spoke of what no one dared to name, of fleeing, of breaking the silence, of leaving a testimony. Mutmuya was the first to join her. "We will not all escape," she said, "but if one reaches the desert, it will be enough. Someone has to tell that the gods do not listen." They prepared the plan patiently. They stole water, dry bread, and waited for a moonless night. But the temple had ears. Someone spoke, or perhaps the priests already knew. Security was doubled. The rumor of punishment swept through the corridors like a wind of stone. That same week, Nefertari was summoned to the sanctuary. They asked her if she still believed in the divinity of Amun. She lowered her head and replied, "I believe in the truth, and the truth does not need sacrifices." The priest glared at her with fury. "Your words are impurity," and he ordered her to be separated from the rest. They did not see her for months. The women of the temple said she had fallen ill. Mutmuya suspected the worst. But one day at dawn, a new inscription appeared on the wall near the well, carved with a crude tool, an open eye, surrounded by 3 lines. No one knew who did it. Some thought it was a sign, others a challenge. The truth is that, from then on, every time a woman was punished, another carved the same symbol on a different stone. It was the silent way of saying, "We are still here." The temple called it desecration. They ordered the signs erased, but new ones always appeared. The message survived because it no longer belonged to just one person. It was an underground language made of dust and hope. Thus, while the priests continued to preach purity, the women began to write their own version of faith. They no longer prayed for the salvation of the soul, but for memory. In whispers, in threads, in stones, they built a different God, one who did not need sacrifices to exist. And among those shadows, Nefertari, the daughter born of right and pain, began to hear the whispers of the old women. Words that spoke of freedom, an unknown but beautiful concept. Without knowing it, she would be the last flame of the lineage that the temple tried to tame and yet never managed to fully extinguish. The history of the temples of Amun does not record a single open rebellion by women. Not because there were none, but because they were raised with the same precision with which the hymns were carved. But beneath the stones of silence, there were always embers, and one of them burned with a name of its own, Hanut Mahite. She was older than Nefertari, a woman with a deep voice and intense eyes, known for her intelligence. The priests feared her without admitting it, because even within obedience, her gaze retained a light they could not tame. For years, she served in the sanctuary without complaint. She was in charge of teaching the younger girls the purification rituals. But she did it differently. She inserted words into the prayers that seemed insignificant, until one night someone understood the hidden message. The inverted syllables of a chant formed a clandestine phrase, "The god sleeps, we awaken." The rebellion had begun, not with shouts, but with echoes. Nefertari, who had returned from her isolation with a thinner face and eyes full of shadows, joined her. Mutmuya did too, despite her age. They knew the risk was absolute, but fear no longer served as a refuge. They began to meet at nightfall in the back courtyard where the echo did not reach the stone corridors. There, among the shadows and the smell of withered lotuses, they devised a plan. The next procession to the river would be their chance. They would leave the walls, and if the gods did not stop them, they would cross into the eastern desert. The day arrived with a gray sky. The priestesses lined up as usual. The young women carried the vessels of offerings. The men chanted the hymns. But in the eyes of some shone a silent determination. Hennet Mahite led the group, holding a lit lamp. When the procession crossed the final arch, she stopped. She turned her face toward the temple and, with a firm voice, uttered a forbidden phrase. "We are not the hands of the god. We are his wounds." The silence was immediate, so absolute that even the wind seemed to stop. Then a murmur of confusion and chaos. The priest ran toward her. The chants broke off. Henut Mahite threw the lamp to the ground. The oil burned, and the flame spread like an omen. The women closest to her followed, running toward the river, dropping their offerings. Some were captured, others disappeared among the reeds. Nefertari managed to grab Mutmuya's hand and drag her toward the shore, but a spear fell at their feet. Mutmuya's scream was lost in the smoke. The guards surrounded Hennet Mahite. She did not try to flee. They forced her to kneel in the sand, in front of the crowd that had gathered outside the temple. The high priest raised his voice. "She has blasphemed. She has broken the harmony of Mat. The punishment will be an example." They took her to the desert beyond the walls. They tied her to a wooden post under the midday sun. There were no whips or blades, only the weight. In Egypt, to die of heat was to die as an offering. The priest called it final purification. No one ever saw her again, but it is said that when the sun went down, the wind carried a voice among the dunes. "The god sleeps, we awaken." Nefertari survived the persecution, hiding in a cave by the river. For 3 days she cared for Mutmuya, who had been wounded in the escape. The old woman was barely breathing. Before she died, she took Nefertari's hand and whispered, "Carve our names where the water cannot reach. Let the stone remember us." That night, Nefertari crawled to a hidden wall on the cliff. With a fragment of copper, she carved the names of all the women who had fallen: Takayat, Henut Mahite, Mutmuya, and dozens more. To each name she added the symbol of the open eye. When she finished, the dawn painted the horizon red. The rebellion was suppressed. The temple reinforced its walls, increased security, and the scribes rewrote the records. In the papyri, Henut Mahite disappeared. Her name was replaced by an anonymous formula, impure one eliminated from service. The walls containing the eye symbols were covered with plaster. History went back to sleep, but silence is never complete. Some of the young women who had seen the flames grew up with a new seed in their hearts. It was not hope, not yet. It was something more subterranean, awareness. They understood that prayers could lie, that gods could remain silent, that power needed victims to sustain its holiness. Nefertari, aged before her time, took refuge in a forgotten workshop. She continued weaving, but in every fabric she hid a red thread. It was her way of remembering those who were gone. No one noticed, or perhaps they preferred not to see it. Sometimes, looking at the empty courtyards, she thought she heard the voices of the women who had fled, brief laughter, barefoot steps, breaths that the wind confused with prayers. The temple continued its routine. The ceremonies went on, the offerings multiplied, and the people once again believed that the gods were just. But beneath the stone slept a different history, the history that power feared. A history written not on papyri, but in wounds. And every time a new girl was consecrated, when the blade passed over her head and her hair fell to the floor, someone in some corner would murmur without moving their lips, "The god sleeps, we awaken."